The high plains of eastern Montana are a vast, empty canvas, a place where the sky is bigger than the land and the wind never stops talking. On Valentine's Day 2012, under a brittle, star-filled sky, that emptiness was shattered by the sound of screeching tires and tortured metal. Just after midnight, near a desolate highway on-ramp outside the small town of Glendave, two cars, both Hondas, had collided with savage force. A black Accord and a silver Civic were crumpled together in a dry irrigation ditch, their headlights askew, casting weird, distorted shadows on the frozen earth. It looked like a horrific accident, but the scene was eerily quiet. There were no sirens, no flashing lights. No one had called 911. When a state trooper on patrol stumbled upon the wreckage an hour later, he found both cars empty. There was no blood on the airbags, no shattered glass on the seats to suggest serious injury. It was as if the occupants had simply walked away from the violent tangle of metal. But they hadn't. During the initial investigation, as a tow truck was preparing to haul away the black Accord, a trooper made a gruesome discovery. He opened the trunk. Inside there was a man. He was about 30 years old, his body bound with thick rope. His chest was a mess of stab wounds, and his head and face had been subjected to such brutal, blunt force trauma that he was unrecognizable. The man in the trunk hadn't died in the car crash. He had been murdered, his body stuffed in the back of his own car like a piece of luggage. Paperwork in the glove compartment identified the owner of the Accord as Ben Carter, a businessman from Billings. A quick check of his driver's license photo and a comparison of fingerprints and DNA confirmed the grim truth. The body in the trunk was Ben Carter. His family had last heard from him on the afternoon of Valentine's Day. He had told them he was driving to North Dakota for a meeting. He never arrived. Ben Carter was, by all accounts, a good man. Successful, well-liked, a family man with 2 young kids. His friends and family were adamant. He had no enemies, no complicated romantic entanglements, no dark secrets. Revenge seemed an unlikely motive. His wallet, phone, and laptop were all missing. The initial theory was a carjacking gone horribly wrong. Maybe the killers had been transporting his body when they got into the accident, panicked, and fled the scene. The second car, the silver Civic, was registered to a man named Kyle Hansen. He lived in a small farming community about 5 miles from the crash site. On the morning of February 15th, as detectives were trying to piece together the puzzle, they got a call. A local rancher reported that Kyle Hansen had shown up at his house in the middle of the night, battered and terrified. He claimed he'd been in an accident, that he'd been robbed. The detectives found Kyle at the local hospital, getting treated for minor cuts and bruises. He was still in a state of shock, his story tumbling out in a panicked rush. He said that on the evening of Valentine's Day, he had been driving with his girlfriend, a 27-year-old woman named Sarah Jenkins. Suddenly, 2 other cars had appeared out of nowhere, boxing him in. They forced him off the road in a terrifying high-speed chase. The chase ended when his Civic collided with one of the other cars, the black Accord, sending both vehicles careening into the ditch. Kyle said he had panicked. The moment the cars came to a stop, he scrambled out of his vehicle and ran for his life. As he sprinted across the dark, frozen field, he heard a gunshot. He glanced back and saw a man's silhouette, a gun aimed in his direction. The shot went wide in the darkness. He just kept running, not stopping for miles until he saw the lights of the rancher's house. It was only later at the hospital, after the adrenaline had subsided, that he remembered Sarah. She had still been in the car when he fled. He had a vague, terrifying memory of hearing her scream, "Let me go," as he ran. He was sure the men had dragged her from the car. She had been abducted. Her phone and her purse were missing from the Civic. The investigation now had a second victim, a kidnapping linked to a brutal murder. The state police launched a massive manhunt for Sarah Jenkins. But they didn't have to look for long. On the afternoon of the 15th, her phone signal reappeared. She was at home, safe. She told the police she was on her way to the station to report what had happened. When she arrived, she corroborated Kyle's story. The chase, the crash. She said that after Kyle had run, 4 masked men had dragged her from the car. They had southern accents, she said, which was strange for Montana. They took her phone and her purse, threatening to kill her. They boasted that they had killed others before. She described a terrifying ordeal. They drove her to an old abandoned brick farmhouse a few miles from the crash site. One man stayed behind to guard her, while the others left, she assumed, to find new targets. Sarah said she waited until her guard fell asleep. She managed to slip out a back window and run, not stopping until she reached the highway at dawn, where she flagged down a passing truck. It was a harrowing tale of survival, but there were holes in her story, big ones. The forensics team had found footprints at the crash site and at the abandoned farmhouse. They belonged to only 2 men, besides Kyle and Sarah. Her claim of 4 abductors was a lie, and her demeanor was all wrong. Kyle was still a wreck, trembling and jumpy. Sarah, recounting a story of being kidnapped by ruthless killers, was unnervously calm. And why hadn't she called the police immediately after escaping? She had bought a new phone, had her SIM card reactivated, but she had waited hours to make a report. The detectives were deeply suspicious. Sarah Jenkins was not a victim, she was a liar. But why? Following Sarah's directions, a team of deputies found the abandoned farmhouse on the night of the 15th. It was a desolate, creepy place, its windows boarded up, its roof sagging. In the yard, they found another vehicle, a small pickup truck with bloodstains on the driver's seat. They entered the house through the same back window Sarah had described. Inside, they found a man asleep on a dusty mattress. He was 31-year-old Mike Reeves. The house was an arsenal. They found homemade ammunition, hunting rifles, and a collection of other crudely self-made guns. Mike Reeves, faced with a team of armed officers, initially stuck to the same story as Sarah: 4 men, 3 Southerners, and him. He was just the driver, he claimed. The others were the killers. But when confronted with the footprint evidence, his story collapsed. He admitted it was just 2 of them, him and his cousin, Luke Connor. Luke was the mastermind, he said. Luke was the killer. Mike's confession was a torrent of fear and self-pity. He said Luke, who was drowning in gambling debts, had recruited him 2 months earlier. He promised him a good-paying job in Wyoming. But the job turned out to be robbery. Mike said he tried to back out after their first job, but Luke had threatened him, taken his phone, and isolated him, controlling his every move. He described the murder of Ben Carter. He said they had found him pulled over on the side of the road, checking his engine. Luke had pretended to ask for directions, then dragged Ben from his car and beat him to death with a tire iron. They put his body in the trunk, planning to dispose of it later. Later that evening, with Mike driving Ben Carter's Accord and Luke driving another stolen car, they had targeted Kyle and Sarah. After the crash, when Kyle fled, they grabbed Sarah and took her back to the farmhouse. Mike said he had then gone to sleep and Sarah had escaped. The police now had a name for the mastermind: Luke Connor. They tracked him to an apartment in Cheyenne, Wyoming, where he was hiding out. A SWAT team took him down without incident. He was 33 years old, with cold, dead eyes that showed no remorse. In the interrogation room, Luke Connor didn't just confess, he boasted. He and his cousin Mike, he said, had committed a total of 4 robberies and murders. They had accumulated over $20,000, and he admitted to another murder, one the police didn't even know about. A man he had shot in a bar fight in Cheyenne a year earlier, a crime he had gotten away with. His confession laid out a horrifying timeline of a 2-man crime spree. It started in October of 2011 in Wyoming. They had robbed and killed a taxi driver. On the same day, they had tried to rob a woman who had cleverly tricked them into letting her go by promising to get them more money from her bank. She was the only one who had gotten away. In January of 2012, they had murdered a truck driver in Wyoming, then burned his body. The blood-stained pickup truck found at the abandoned farmhouse was his. On February 13th, they had made their way to Montana and killed a man named Lee who was driving a new Toyota. And on February 14th, Valentine's Day, they had murdered Ben Carter. Later that night, they had targeted Kyle and Sarah, which led to the crash that had unraveled their entire bloody enterprise. Luke's motive was simple. He had over $300,000 in gambling debts. He was desperate. And he had a simple, brutal rule: no survivors. He and Mike killed every one of their victims to prevent them from being identified, to stop them from going to the police. The woman in Wyoming had been a mistake, one he didn't intend to repeat. Kyle Hansen and Sarah Jenkins surviving was, in his words, an unexpected complication. But why had Sarah survived? Why had they broken their own cardinal rule? The answer was as bizarre as it was disturbing. It came from Luke, who seemed to take a perverse pleasure in revealing the final, twisted detail of the story. Sarah Jenkins had survived because Mike Reeves, the bumbling, terrified accomplice, had fallen for her. While he was in the back seat with her on the drive to the farmhouse, he had found her ID in her purse. He discovered that they shared the same birthday, a different year, but the same day. Sarah, sensing an opportunity, had started talking to him. She played on this strange coincidence, creating a bizarre instant connection. Luke, driving, had watched them in the rearview mirror, annoyed by their chattering. At the farmhouse, Mike had made a strange request. He asked Luke if he could have some fun with Sarah before they killed her. Luke, uncaring, had agreed. He left them alone. Mike and Sarah then had sex. Afterwards, something in Mike had shifted. He felt a strange, protective affection for this woman he had just met, this woman he'd been planning to murder. He decided to let her go. He gave her $200 for a bus ticket. He gave her a red shirt of his own, telling her to change out of her white one so she wouldn't be as visible in the dark if Luke came back. And he told her what to say to the police. Lie about the number of killers. Lie about their accents. Tell them they were from the South. Mislead the investigation. Throw them off the scent of two local boys. Sarah Jenkins had followed his instructions to the letter. She had lied to the police, deliberately hindering the investigation to protect the man who had kidnapped her, the man who had been complicit in a string of brutal murders. The man who had raped her and then saved her life. She even kept the red shirt he had given her. The police were stunned. Sarah's behavior was a textbook case of Stockholm Syndrome, a psychological phenomenon where a victim develops feelings of empathy, even affection for their captor. In the terrifying life-or-death situation she had been in, with one man, Luke, wanting her dead, and another, Mike, offering her a chance at survival, her mind had formed a powerful, irrational bond with her protector. His act of kindness, however twisted and self-serving, had made her feel grateful. So grateful that she was willing to become an accomplice after the fact, to protect a serial killer. Based on the nature of the victim's wounds, which suggested two different weapons had been used, and the sheer physical strength required to subdue the male victims, the police concluded that Mike Reeves was no mere driver. He had been an active participant in all of the murders. In September of 2012, both Mike Reeves and Luke Connor were sentenced to death. Their reign of terror was over, but the case left a lingering, disturbing question. It was a story of brutal, senseless violence driven by greed and desperation, but it was also a story about the strange, dark, and unpredictable corners of the human mind. A story where a shared birthday and a moment of twisted affection had saved a woman's life, and in doing so had brought two ruthless killers to justice. It was a chilling reminder that sometimes the most unexpected acts of human connection can bloom in the darkest of places.